It was a damp, gray morning in central Pennsylvania when police found a light blue Honda Civic pulled onto the shoulder of a narrow country road. The engine was off, the driver's door cracked open, wipers were still halfway up the windshield. Inside sat a backpack, a few notebooks, and a folded campus parking permit that read Ethan Kline, Penn State Architecture. Ethan had been missing for less than 12 hours, but the scene already felt wrong, quiet, deliberate, and almost staged. Rainwater pooled around a single muddy footprint on the driver's side door too large to be his. The rest of the ground was clean, as if someone had known a storm was coming and used it to erase their tracks. Ethan was 23, reserved, gifted, the kind of student who sketched buildings for fun and called his mother every Sunday. Friends said he left a late-night study session just after 11 p.m., promising he'd be home by midnight. He never made it. For months, State College buzzed with rumors, a jealous classmate, a secret affair, even whispers about something he'd seen near Raystown Lake. None of it fit, and without a body, no one could even say for sure if Ethan was alive or dead. 2 decades later, a retired detective reopened the evidence box, and with it, a mystery that refused to die. What could a single DNA particle on an old zipper reveal after 24 years? And who, exactly, had been sitting in Ethan's car that rainy night? If stories like this grip you like they do me, hit that like so more true crime lovers can find it. Comment where you're watching from, you're part of this true crime family now. And subscribe, it fuels this channel to bring you more stories just like this one. To understand what really happened that night, we need to go back to where it all began. October 13th, 1999. A cold drizzle hung over State College, the kind of night that pressed fog against streetlights and made the small college town feel smaller. Ethan Kline was in his final undergraduate year at Penn State, one of the top students in his architecture program. Friends described him as quiet but warm, the sort of person who stayed after class to help others finish their models, then biked home with his sketchbook balanced on one arm. That Wednesday had been typical. A long studio session, coffee runs, a group project meeting in the design lab that stretched past 11 p.m. The last confirmed sighting came from the building's security camera, Ethan exiting through the west doors, wearing his gray hoodie and carrying a thick folio under his arm. He waved to someone off camera, then disappeared into the mist. When he failed to show for his morning class, no one panicked. College students oversleep, lose track of time. But by evening, when his roommate realized Ethan's bed hadn't been slept in, and his car wasn't in the apartment lot, the unease began to spread. By 8 p.m., a missing person report was filed. Just before dawn, a local farmer noticed a car parked awkwardly along Old Pine Road, a winding, 2-lane route that runs parallel to a set of abandoned rail tracks. He thought maybe someone had broken down, but when he peered inside, he saw keys dangling from the ignition and an untouched backpack on the passenger seat. Within hours, state police were on scene. The engine was cold, the driver's seat pushed back slightly farther than Ethan was known to sit. On the exterior, officers noted a faint smear on the driver's side window, as if someone had brushed against it with a wet sleeve, and one distinct, muddy footprint stamped near the lower door. The footprint was men's size 12. Ethan wore a 9½ There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no torn clothing fibers, no blood. But something about the position of the car bothered detectives. It wasn't angled like someone had pulled off in distress, more like it had been parked neatly and left. By the following day, news crews had descended on State College. Ethan's mother, Diane Kline, arrived from Pittsburgh, her voice trembling through live interviews as she pleaded for tips. His professors described him as the heartbeat of the studio. His roommate, Tyler Vance, told investigators Ethan had seemed distracted that week, pacing their apartment, skipping meals, double-checking his phone. He said something like, "I think I screwed up," Tyler recalled. But when I asked what he meant, he just laughed it off. Detectives later discovered that Ethan had withdrawn $60 in cash from an ATM near campus at 10:37 p.m., the night he vanished. The security footage showed him glancing over his shoulder twice, alone. No further activity on his debit card. No cell phone pings after 11 p.m. For 3 days, hundreds of volunteers scoured the surrounding woods, drainages, and rail corridors. Search dogs traced Ethan's scent from the driver's side of the car down an embankment toward the tree line and then abruptly lost it 20 yards in. Helicopters with infrared scanned the forest canopy. Nothing. One diver team was deployed to a nearby retention pond after a tip suggested headlights had been seen reflecting off the water that night. The pond was drained. Empty. The official narrative soon became what the press dubbed the vanishing architect. Police theorized Ethan might have gone for a walk to clear his head and gotten lost. But to those who knew him, that theory fell apart instantly. Ethan wasn't impulsive. He planned everything, from class projects to weekend hikes. He even kept a spreadsheet for his meals. Then came the whispers, the kind that creep through college towns like wildfire. Some said Ethan had been having an affair with a married professor. Others believed he'd been involved in a plagiarism dispute that got out of hand. Reporters also dug into a strange sighting 2 days prior, a blue sedan following Ethan's Civic across campus. Witnesses couldn't agree on the plate number, but one remembered a Penn State faculty parking sticker. Investigators ran over 1,000 vehicles matching the description. No hits. Another lead came from a fisherman at Raystown Lake, 40 miles south. He claimed he'd seen a man fitting Ethan's description near the docks around 1 a.m., arguing with someone before both disappeared into the darkness. But when detectives pulled security footage from a nearby bait shop, the timestamp didn't align. The camera had been reset during daylight savings. The man might not have been Ethan at all. Weeks passed. Midterms came and went. Flyers with Ethan's face, soft-spoken eyes, gentle smile curled and faded on telephone poles. His family refused to leave town, renting a motel room where they organized search maps and fielded crank calls from self-proclaimed psychics. The investigation expanded into surrounding counties, but by Christmas 1999, leads had dried up. The car was impounded, the backpack sealed into evidence. Detective Greg Marston, the case lead, admitted to reporters that they were running on fumes. He described it as one of those cases where everything looks like it should make sense until you start connecting the dots, and none of them touch. Then, nearly 2 months after the disappearance, a forensic tech reviewing the car photos noticed something overlooked. A faint partial handprint on the inside of the passenger side window smudged, facing outward, as if someone had been bracing to get out. The print was too blurred for a full match, but its size suggested a woman's hand. When investigators re-interviewed Ethan's classmates, one name surfaced repeatedly: Lena Hart, a fellow architecture student known for her sharp designs and her on-again and off-again friendship with Ethan. Lena denied being in his car that night, but when shown the photo of the smudged handprint, she went pale and asked to speak to an attorney. No charges were filed, and without clearer forensic evidence, the case slowly began to fade. By 2001, new crimes and headlines had overtaken Ethan Kline's disappearance. Diane Kline moved back to Pittsburgh, still keeping her son's Penn State sketchbook on the kitchen counter, pages warped from the moisture of her tears. Detective Marston retired in 2004. The casebox transferred to storage. The file sat untouched for nearly 2 decades, until technology finally caught up with the evidence. Because sometimes, justice doesn't move quickly. It just waits for science to catch up. The morning after Ethan's car was discovered, Pennsylvania State Police established a temporary command post at the edge of Old Pine Road, a pop-up tent beside a soybean field. Floodlights cut through the fog while officers in rain gear mapped tire tracks and cataloged evidence markers. The sound of radios crackled against the stillness. Detective Greg Marston, a 47-year-old investigator with 20 years on the force, took lead on the case. He had seen dozens of disappearances, some tragic, some self-inflicted, but something about Ethan's scene gnawed at him. It was too neat, he'd later tell a reporter. Like someone wanted it found. The first order of business was forensics. Technicians combed through the Honda Civic inch by inch. The keys bore no prints except Ethan's. The door handles wiped clean. The one partial footprint near the driver's door yielded an outsole pattern matching a work boot, possibly Timberland. But the soil was too wet to preserve detail. Inside the car, Ethan's folio contained architecture sketches, a coffee-stained receipt from the campus cafe, and a folded scrap of paper with a single handwritten note. "Meet me where we watch the lights." It wasn't in Ethan's handwriting. Investigators traced the paper to a notebook brand sold only at the campus bookstore. They compared handwriting samples from Ethan's classmates and professors. Nothing matched. But the phrase "where we watch the lights" stuck with Marston. Ethan had once told his mother about driving out to the overlook near Raystown Lake to photograph the dam lights at night. If that's what the note referred to, it could mean Ethan planned to meet someone there after leaving the study group. So on October 16th, 3 days after the disappearance, officers and divers searched the overlook and surrounding trails. The only thing they found was a crushed energy drink can and 2 cigarette butts, both too waterlogged for prints or DNA at the time. It wasn't much, but it confirmed one chilling thing. Someone else had been out there that night. Detectives began interviewing Ethan's circle. The 5 classmates from his study group were cleared quickly. They'd stayed in the lab until after midnight, backed by swipe card data. Then came Lena Hart. Lena admitted she'd had a falling out with Ethan 2 weeks before he vanished. They'd once been close, even worked together on a design competition. But recently, Ethan had confronted her about using one of his sketches in her own portfolio. "It wasn't plagiarism," she insisted. "We collaborated on that idea." Still, witnesses recalled seeing them arguing outside the architecture building that week. One student overheard Ethan saying, "You know this could ruin both of us." When detectives pressed Lena about where she was the night of October 13th, she said she'd been at her off-campus apartment watching a movie with her roommate Claire. Claire confirmed the story. Phone records showed Lena's landline made 2 short calls around 10:50 and 11:30 p.m., both to her mother. Her alibi seemed solid, until a week later, when lab results revealed the muddy footprints Soul-type Timberland Pro Series. Size 12 matched a pair owned by Lena's ex-boyfriend, Jake Miller. Jake was a 25-year-old construction major with a short temper and a long record of minor assaults. He'd dated Lena the year before, but things had ended badly. According to classmates, he'd grown jealous of her friendship with Ethan. When questioned, Jake didn't deny owning those boots. He said half the campus wore them. "Yeah, I didn't like the kid," he told police. "But I never touched him. Ask Lena, she's the one who told me he was obsessed with her." That line, "obsessed with her," changed the tone of the investigation. Suddenly, detectives weren't sure who was protecting who. Jake's truck was searched, his boots seized, and his alibi that he'd been working a late construction shift checked out. His foreman vouched for him. No DNA, no blood, no fibers. Once again, the case circled back to zero. By early November, the story had captured national attention. College forums speculated everything from cult abductions to serial offenders. Strangers phoned in daily with visions or anonymous confessions. Detective Marston began to see fatigue in his team's faces. The long nights, the false leads, the quiet drive back to the station after another empty search. One night, sitting alone under the hum of fluorescent lights, he stared at Ethan's smiling photo and whispered, "What did you see that night, kid?" That question haunted him for years. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, a park ranger near Raystown Lake reported finding a torn piece of gray fabric tangled in a branch near the water line. The texture matched Ethan's hoodie. For a moment, hope surged, but lab results crushed it. The DNA wasn't his. The evidence pile grew: cigarette butts, partial prints, fibers, but none of it connected cleanly. Without a body, prosecutors couldn't even declare foul play, so the department scaled back. Volunteers stopped showing up. The reward posters yellowed in the rain. And as winter hit, the case slowly faded into silence. In 2002, Lena Hart graduated and moved out of state. Jake Miller was arrested for bar fights but never linked to Ethan. Detective Marston transferred to another unit. The file on Ethan Kline became just one of dozens sitting in the county's cold case storage cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each marked with a name that had long since stopped appearing in the news. Every now and then, Marston would open the Kline box, leafing through photos of that rain-soaked car, the blurred handprint, the cryptic note. Something in his gut told him they'd all missed something small, buried in the noise. Then, in 2006, out of nowhere, A tip came from a former Penn State janitor named Carl Winters. He claimed he'd seen Ethan the night he disappeared, or at least someone who looked like him. Carl said he'd been locking up the architecture building around 11:15 p.m. when a dark sedan pulled up. Ethan got in, he said, but not alone. There was a woman in the passenger seat, blonde, wearing a hood. When shown photos, Carl hesitated but pointed to Lena. Could have been her, he said. But I can't swear to it. Investigators brought Lena back in. She denied it again, calm, collected, rehearsed. I didn't see him after that night in class, she repeated. I've told you everything. Without hard proof, Marston had to let her go. But something about her reaction, her calmness, didn't feel like innocence. It felt like exhaustion. By 2010, the Kline family had moved on publicly but not privately. Diane still kept a candle burning in her son's room. His younger sister, Marissa, became a forensic scientist, a career she later admitted was because of Ethan. The town stopped talking about it. Students came and went. The road where Ethan's car was found was repaved, and the one piece of evidence that could have held the truth, his backpack, sat sealed in a box, untouched, for the next 14 years. A detail that would, in time, change everything. Because sometimes justice doesn't die, it just waits. By 2011, the case of Ethan Kline had become a footnote in Pennsylvania's long history of missing persons. Every few years, his name resurfaced in online forums or anniversary articles. Penn State student vanishes without a trace, but there were no new leads, no suspects, and no closure. For Ethan's family, it was like grieving inside a clock that refused to move. His mother, Diane, still lived in the same Pittsburgh home where she'd raised him. Each Christmas, she hung a stocking with his name stitched in blue thread. Each birthday, she baked his favorite lemon cake and left a slice by the window, just in case. You don't stop being a mother, she said once in an interview. You just keep talking to a quieter room. Meanwhile, Detective Greg Marston had retired from the state police. He'd taken a part-time teaching job at a community college, lecturing on investigative procedure. But no matter how many case studies he taught, his mind always circled back to Ethan. The footprint, the handprint, the note. None of it had ever fit neatly, and that bothered him more than anything. He would sometimes visit the evidence locker on slow afternoons, signing out the Kline case box under the pretense of instructional use. He'd spread the contents across his desk: crime scene photos, phone logs, maps drawn with shaky red circles. One afternoon, as he stared at the photograph of Ethan's backpack, he noticed something odd, a faint outline of a small tear near the zipper, like a snag from a rough grip. He wrote it off then. He'd revisit that photo again years later, when it would mean everything. During those years, theories about Ethan's disappearance evolved into online folklore. Reddit threads and cold case blogs exploded with speculation. Some said Ethan had stumbled onto a secret relationship between faculty members and had been silenced. Others claimed he'd discovered great tampering, or had been caught up in a drug deal gone wrong. There was even a small but persistent group who believed he'd run away voluntarily, that the perfectionist student had cracked under pressure and vanished to start over. They pointed to the $60 he withdrew that night as proof. But Diane never bought that. He wouldn't leave me wondering, she told a reporter in 2014. He called home every week. He wouldn't let me think he was dead if he wasn't. As for Lena Hart, she had moved to Denver, married, and changed her last name. She rarely spoke about her college years. In a 2015 alumni newsletter interview, when asked if she kept in touch with anyone from her architecture cohort, she simply said, "No. That chapter's closed." But it wasn't. That same year, a Penn State student majoring in criminology reopened Ethan's case for her senior thesis and publicly accused investigators of mishandling Lena's involvement. She published a 40-page analysis online, arguing that gender bias had allowed Lena to avoid scrutiny. If Ethan had been female and Lena male, she wrote, this investigation might have gone very differently. The post went viral for a week, then disappeared. But it was enough to bring the Kline case briefly back into public discussion. Detective Marston, now 63, read the post. It reignited something in him, not anger, but restlessness. Maybe the student was wrong about bias, but she was right about one thing: they'd missed something. In early 2018, Marston visited the cold case unit in Harrisburg. The evidence boxes were stacked high, tagged, faded. The Kline case was box #2199A. He signed it out one last time, this time not for teaching for closure. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and dust. He noticed the bagged contents of Ethan's backpack, including a disposable camera that had been listed but never developed. Back in 1999, digital scanning had been expensive, and the negatives were, reportedly, fogged. Marston took them home, dropped them off at a local photo lab with modern recovery software, and waited. 3 days later, the technician called. "Most of the film's ruined," she said, "but you've got a few partials." What developed stunned him. The first 2 photos were of architecture models, normal student stuff. But the third showed something else. Ethan's reflection in a glass door, holding his sketchbook, and behind him, a blurred figure standing in the hallway. The timestamp matched the night he vanished, the 13th of October 1999, 10:52 p.m. It wasn't clear who the figure was, but the outline slightly shorter, narrow shoulders, hair pulled back fit Lena's build. Marston stared at the photo for hours, heart pounding. Was it proof she'd been there that night or just coincidence? In 2021, Pennsylvania's cold case unit adopted a new pilot program, testing touch DNA analysis, a method sensitive enough to detect skin cell residue on old objects. Marston, though long retired, knew the program's director, Detective Rachel Lynn. He reached out and asked, almost sheepishly, if she'd consider testing something for him, Ethan Kline's backpack zipper. Rachel agreed. "No promises," she said. "After 20 years, odds are near zero." The evidence was sent to a lab in Quantico. For 3 months, silence. Then, one spring morning, Marston's phone rang. Rachel's voice trembled with restrained excitement. "Greg, we got something." The analysis had recovered a partial male DNA profile from the zipper's metal teeth, too degraded for a direct match in CODIS, but clean enough to cross-reference with old evidence. The results stunned them both. It matched DNA from an unsolved assault on a female student at Penn State in December 1999, 2 months after Ethan vanished. The assault victim, identified in records only as K.R., had described her attacker as calm, persuasive, someone she vaguely recognized from campus. The case had gone nowhere because DNA testing at the time was inconclusive. Now, both traces, hers and Ethan's backpack, were linked by the same partial male profile. That changed everything. By summer 2023, the state police officially reopened the Kline case under the Cold Case Initiative. Media outlets picked it up again. Break into 4-year-old Penn State disappearance. The Kline family, weary but hopeful, met with investigators for the first time in over a decade. Diane cried quietly as Detective Lynn showed her the evidence board photos of Ethan, maps, and a new line connecting the 2 cases. "You're telling me," she whispered, "my boy's case is tied to another victim?" Rachel nodded. "It means he might not have been the first, or the last." The working theory shifted. Maybe Ethan hadn't vanished by choice or accident. Maybe he'd encountered someone dangerous, a predator hiding in plain sight on campus. In reviewing the assault file, Rachel noticed something overlooked. A statement from a witness who'd seen a man lingering near the architecture building that December, smoking near the west doors. The witness described him as tall, wearing a maintenance uniform. The name tag, they recalled, read Carl. Rachel froze. Carl Winters, the janitor who'd given that ambiguous statement years earlier about seeing Ethan enter a car with a blonde woman. Carl had since retired to a small town near Huntingdon. And as investigators soon learned, he hadn't just worked at Penn State's architecture department, he'd also been employed part-time at the Raystown Lake Maintenance Depot, the same place Ethan loved to visit. After 24 years of silence, the circle was closing, not around Lena, not around Jake, but around a man everyone had overlooked because he seemed ordinary. But before they could confront him, detectives needed one final piece of proof, something to link Carl Winters directly to Ethan's last night alive. And that proof was about to surface, buried in a police storage unit no one had opened in 2 decades. The evidence vault of the Pennsylvania State Police was quiet, a cavern of dust, concrete, and forgotten stories. Dozens of metal shelves lined the corridor, stacked with cardboard boxes marked in fading Sharpie. Among them, behind a row of unsolved homicide files, sat one that hadn't been touched since 2004. Kline, missing person. It was early May 2024 when Detective Rachel Lynn and forensic tech Alex Monroe pulled that box from the shelf. Their goal was simple: recatalog everything before sending it for secondary DNA analysis. Inside were the usual items: crime scene photos, the note that said, "Meet me where we watch the lights," Ethan's sketches, and the sealed evidence bags containing fibers, prints, and his gray hoodie. But tucked between folders at the bottom, beneath a layer of packing foam, Rachel found something else: a small plastic vial labeled Trace Sample #47, door handle, passenger side. The vial had never been logged in the official inventory. Someone had collected it but never entered it into the evidence system, and inside was a single strand of hair. Rachel frowned. How does a sample like this just vanish from paperwork? Alex shook his head. Back then, pre-digital logging, it happened more often than anyone admits. Still, it was remarkable. The hair had been sealed airtight. The label handwriting looked like Greg Marston's. Rachel called him the next morning. At 66, Marston was living quietly near Harrisburg, gardening, writing short essays on criminal procedure. When he heard Rachel's voice over the phone, he went still. "A hair?" he asked. "From the passenger door?" "Yes. Looks like yours on the label." He sighed. "It might be. I remember pulling something with tweezers that night, but the lab told me it was too degraded. I guess I filed it separately for future testing." Rachel smiled. "Well, the future's here." The sample was rushed to the Quantico DNA lab, under chain of custody supervision. A week later, Rachel got the call. The hair contained mitochondrial DNA, partial, but viable. When cross-checked with the touch DNA from the backpack zipper and the assault case from 1999, all three samples aligned. Same male contributor. Now they had a genetic fingerprint still unnamed, but irrefutable. That night, Rachel and Marston spread the files across her office table. The link between Ethan's disappearance and the December 1999 assault was no longer a coincidence, it was a pattern. And the one man who intersected both locations, Penn State's architecture building and Raystown Lake maintenance, was Carl Winters. They reran his name through updated databases. Winters, now 71, lived in a trailer just outside Huntingdon. He'd retired from the university in 2002 after a stress-related leave. He had never been arrested, but records showed a pattern of job hopping, campus maintenance, park groundskeeping, janitorial contracts, always in places that offered isolation and privacy. Even more unsettling, when Rachel requested archived employee rosters, she found that Carl Winters had worked night shifts on both October 13 and December 2 of 1999. On the 22nd of May 2024, Rachel and Marston drove to Huntingdon. The road wound through forested hills, the air heavy with spring rain. They found Winters's trailer sitting at the edge of a field, a satellite dish rusting on the roof. He answered the door slowly, frail, balding, his eyes sharp but cautious. "Carl Winters?" "Yeah." "Who's asking?" "Detective Lynn, State Police. This is retired Detective Marston. We'd like to ask you a few questions about an old case, Ethan Kline." At the sound of the name, Winters' jaw tightened. "That again? That was 20-something years ago." Marston said softly, "You remember him?" "Course I do. Kid disappeared. I told the cops what I saw. Didn't do nothing wrong." Rachel noticed his hands shaking slightly, not with age, but tension. She nodded toward a framed photo on the counter. A younger Carl wearing a Penn State maintenance uniform, smiling beside a row of lockers. "You still keep your old badge?" she asked casually. He stared at her. "Why?" "Because we found your name tag listed as Carl in a witness statement from a different case, a case that connects to Ethan's, and we've got DNA linking both scenes." Silence filled the trailer. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Winters swallowed hard. "DNA, huh? You sure about that?" Rachel met his eyes. "Sure enough to get a warrant." The following day, State Police searched the property. Behind the trailer, They found an old storage shed filled with discarded maintenance equipment, shovels, mops, and a set of university-issued overalls wrapped in a garbage bag. Inside one pocket, a laminated Penn State ID badge. The name had been scratched off, but under infrared scan, the imprint revealed it Kline. That was enough. Carl Winters was brought in for questioning. For 6 hours, he denied everything. Said the badge must have been left behind in a locker, that the DNA was contaminated, that those scientists just want headlines. But when investigators confronted him with the recovered photos from Ethan's disposable camera, the faint reflection of Ethan and the blurred figure in the hallway, something in him shifted. He leaned forward, voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he whispered. He was supposed to just talk. Rachel kept her tone steady. "Talk about what?" Winters exhaled slowly. "He saw me. The night before it happened. I was with that girl. The one from the studio. She didn't know about my record at the depot. He followed us out to the lot and started yelling. I tried to calm him down. Just get him to stop. He wouldn't." He paused, eyes distant. It was raining hard. He slipped near the car door, hit his head on the pavement. I panicked. I thought he was dead. Marston's hands clenched. "So you staged the scene?" Winters nodded faintly. "I drove his car down the road, left it where you'd find it. Took his bag to make it look like a robbery. Then I dumped him near the lake." Rachel's voice hardened. "And the assault 2 months later?" "The student who survived." Winters' silence was his answer. He finally whispered, "I just couldn't stop seeing his face after that. I thought, maybe if I did it again, I'd feel less guilty. But it just made it worse." He lowered his head. "You can't bury guilt. It grows roots." 2 days later, a search team returned to Raystown Lake, the same site combed 24 years earlier. Using modern sonar, they scanned the shallows near the old overlook. 97 feet below the surface, divers located skeletal remains caught in a tangle of fishing line and sediment. Dental records confirmed what Diane Kline had both dreaded and prayed for. It was Ethan. Beside the remains were fragments of a gray hoodie and a rusted Penn State keychain. When news broke, vigils sprang up across campus. Students, most of them born after Ethan vanished, left flowers by the architecture building. Carl Winters was charged with second-degree murder and assault with intent. His confession matched the forensic evidence. In court, prosecutors described a man who had lived in quiet torment for decades, his guilt surfacing only when science caught up to him. During sentencing, Diane Kline spoke softly. "I don't hate you, Mr. Winters. I hate the years you took from us, the birthdays, the graduations, the laughter that should have filled our home." Winters wept openly. He was sentenced to life without parole. For Detective Marston, it was bittersweet. He attended the service at Penn State Chapel where Ethan's ashes were laid to rest. As rain tapped the stained glass windows, he whispered to the empty pew beside him, "We found you, kid. We finally found you." But in his mind, one question lingered. How many other names lay sealed in forgotten boxes, waiting for a future that might finally listen? The trial of Carl Winters lasted just 9 days, but for the Kline family, it stretched like a lifetime. Every moment in that courtroom was another reminder of what they'd lost, not just Ethan, but the decades stolen by uncertainty. The prosecution presented its case cleanly: the DNA link, the recovered badge, the confession, and the remains found at Raystown Lake. The defense argued accident, panic, confusion, but no one could mistake the weight of guilt in Winters's trembling voice. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Diane Kline didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "It's over." But the truth was, it would never really be over. Closure, people say, comes with answers. But for parents like Diane, closure only means replacing one kind of pain with another. The ache of not knowing with the ache of knowing too much. After sentencing, she returned to Pittsburgh, sold the house she'd lived in for 30 years, and used part of the restitution fund to start a scholarship at Penn State's College of Architecture. Each year, it would go to a student who embodied Ethan's quiet creativity, someone who stayed late in the studio, someone who believed in detail and discipline. She called it the Ethan Kline Memorial Fellowship for Integrity in Design. It became more than a scholarship. It became a legacy. For Detective Greg Marston, The case's resolution was both a vindication and a ghost. The day Winters was convicted, Rachel Lynn invited him to stand beside her at the press conference. Cameras flashed as reporters asked him what it felt like to see justice after so long. Marston hesitated before answering. "It doesn't feel like justice," he said quietly. "It feels like we finally caught up to the truth." In the months that followed, he became a quiet advocate for cold case funding, traveling to universities and state houses to talk about the power of persistence. The smallest detail, he'd tell his students. A photograph, a fingerprint, a forgotten vial of hair, that's all it takes. You just have to keep looking. His lectures were less about police work and more about faith. Faith in time, in science, in the idea that every lie eventually leaves a trace. But even as he spoke, Marston carried a private guilt. He had been the one who'd missed the hair sample back in '99, the one who hadn't pursued Carl Winters harder. It haunted him quietly, but he used that guilt the same way Diane used her grief to create something that mattered. Detective Rachel Lynn's work on the Kline case earned her national recognition. The success of the touch DNA analysis led to new funding for Pennsylvania's Cold Trace Initiative, a statewide project to revisit unsolved disappearances with modern forensic tools. Within a year, the program helped identify remains in 2 additional cold cases, both victims of offenders who had slipped through the cracks of 1,990 investigative limitations. Rachel often said that Ethan's case changed her view of law enforcement entirely. "We always think we're fighting criminals," she told a journalist, "but sometimes we're really fighting time. And time always fights dirty." When asked what stood out most to her about the investigation, she didn't mention DNA or confessions. She mentioned Diane. "I've seen a lot of parents lose children," she said, "but I've never seen someone keep believing for 24 years without ever hardening. That kind of hope, it moves you." When the full story broke in October 2024, national media picked it up instantly. Headlines read, "Penn State mystery solved after 24 years. DNA links maintenance worker to student's disappearance." Podcasts, documentaries, and even Netflix producers reached out to the Kline family. Diane declined all of them. "This isn't a show," she told a reporter. "It's my son's life." Still, the case sparked conversations across the country about how many other Ethans were out there, cases shelved, evidence misplaced, lives forgotten. Forensic labs began retesting archived materials using touch DNA and mitochondrial sequencing across the U.S. Dozens of unsolved disappearances from the 1,980 and 90 seconds saw breakthroughs. Ethan's name had become something larger, a reminder that truth can age, but it never expires. At Penn State, the architecture building that once echoed with late-night design chatter now bore a brass plaque by its entrance. In memory of Ethan Kline, class of 2000, whose curiosity and compassion left an imprint that time could not erase. Each October, faculty and students gathered under dim lamplight, lighting candles and sketching tiny buildings in his honor. They called it the Night of the Lights, after the mysterious note found in Ethan's car. The phrase, once cryptic, had transformed into something profound, a symbol of resilience, of light that doesn't die even when the rain falls hardest. One year, Detective Marston attended the vigil quietly. As the students lifted their candles, he whispered, "Meet me where we watch the lights." And for the first time in decades, the words no longer felt like a riddle. They felt like peace. At the Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Winters rarely spoke after sentencing. He spent most days in the prison infirmary, declining interviews. But a few months before his death in 2026, he agreed to meet with a journalist from the Harrisburg Ledger. When asked why he'd kept Ethan's badge all those years, he replied, "I didn't keep it as a trophy. I kept it because I wanted to remember the worst thing I ever did. If I forgot, it'd be like killing him again." He died of heart failure that winter. No family claimed the body. The warden later said he kept a small envelope in his cell. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping of Ethan's vigil and a note scrawled on prison stationery, "Tell his mother I'm sorry." The letter was never delivered. On the 25th anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, a local journalist visited Raystown Lake at dusk. The water was still, the sun dipping behind the dam. He recorded a short segment about the case's legacy, ending with this reflection. Justice doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it comes with a whisper, decades later, when the rain has long stopped falling. Back in Pittsburgh, Diane Kline kept one photo framed in her living room, Ethan at his drafting table, smiling faintly, a pencil tucked behind his ear. Next to it sat a small candle, burned down to a stub. She didn't replace it anymore. She didn't need to, because after 24 years, she finally knew where her son was. And for the first time, the silence in that house didn't sound like absence. It sounded like rest. There's something haunting about a mystery that outlives the people who started it. For 24 years, Ethan Kline's name sat in a file box, gathering dust, fading ink, and hope that thinned with every passing season. But inside that silence, truth was quietly waiting. It waited in a single strand of hair sealed in plastic. It waited in the hands of a retired detective who couldn't stop asking questions. And it waited in the heart of a mother who never stopped believing her son deserved to be found. Ethan didn't vanish because he was reckless, or because he wanted to disappear. He vanished because someone ordinary made a terrible choice, one that rippled through decades and lives. And yet, what began as tragedy became a story about perseverance, science, and the human refusal to let the past stay buried. Cold cases aren't cold because they're forgotten. They're cold because they're waiting. Waiting for technology, for timing, for that one person who looks twice at something everyone else overlooked. That's what solved Ethan's case. Not luck, not fate, persistence. When we think about stories like this, it's easy to focus on the darkness, the killer, the cruelty, the years lost. But the real story lives in the light that follows, the scholarship bearing Ethan's name, the students who design in his memory, the families who now believe maybe, just maybe, their answers are still out there. Because justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers across time, across evidence, across the hearts of those who refuse to give up. So the next time you hear about a cold case, remember Ethan Kline. Remember the mother who never stopped hoping. Remember the detective who kept a promise long after the world stopped watching. And remember, truth never disappears. It just waits for someone to find it. If stories like this move you like they do me, hit that like so more true crime lovers can find it. Comment where you're watching from. You're part of this true crime family now. And subscribe. It fuels this channel to bring you more stories that remind us why justice is worth the wait.